Hey, good afternoon. This is Nick Merker again with Privacy Chat, and today we're going to be talking about how privacy is continuing to be an issue of concern in this current state of affairs. Again, if you're not familiar, I'm Nick Merker. I'm the chair of Ice Miller's Data Security and Privacy Practice based out of Indianapolis, Indiana. And I can be found at nmerker on any of the channels listed on the right there: Facebook, Twitch, YouTube, Instagram, or Twitter. And again, today these are supposed to be just maybe 20 to 30 minutes, just kind of a privacy update. On some days I'll have a guest speaker, some days I'll focus on particular topics. And this day I'm just going to kind of do a news update and kind of focus in on what privacy really means during the current climate and how privacy still continues, although a lot of the world is kind of standing still. So with that, the first thing I want to touch on is how the FTC has issued an alert associated with coronavirus scams. There have been a lot of new scams associated with this event. As you can imagine, as the FTC says here, scammers are taking advantage of fears surrounding the coronavirus and trying to get folks to spend money with the scammer instead of spending money in places that they should be spending it. The FTC gives you some good guidelines, like hanging up on robocalls. What I like about this is that these are not new guidelines. If you go to this website and you kind of read the FTC's recommendations, they're pretty good recommendations just for daily life outside of this situation. Like you probably get robocalls all the time. You probably get fake texts all the time, spam texts and the like, just like you would spam emails. The FTC says, hey, don't pay attention to those. Try to know that folks are doing that. So this is a good kind of privacy awareness or security awareness item from the FTC on trying to avoid these scams. And in particular, with the coronavirus on the last bullet there, the scammers are offering you vaccines, home test kits, sometimes toilet paper, hand lotion, hand sanitizers, Clorox wipes, things that you can't find in the store. Scammers are showing you that, hey, they're available here, come buy them. I didn't include all of the bullets from the FTC's website, but something that scammers are doing is coming up with fake online stores, whether it's a new Amazon distributor or Amazon seller that comes out of the woodwork out of nowhere and is offering you a home test kit or something that they want you to buy. That might be a scam. Although Amazon is doing a great job kind of shutting these down very, very quickly. It's not just Amazon, of course. There's all sorts of other platforms that people are using to engage in this activity. It's not just common things like I mentioned, things associated with the coronavirus. Like I mentioned, it's anything you might want that you can't get right now. And one of the things I saw the other day, and I should have put a picture of it. It was something on Amazon again, and it was someone offering vitamin supplements. So, but they were, if you did a search for, I forget what it actually was, the something chlorine thing that folks are going to be using to treat folks with symptoms with the coronavirus. If you did that search on Amazon, the first sponsored link was a link to some home remedy nutritional supplement. So folks are trying to gain an advantage in the market on the fear in this situation. The FTC did a good job of kind of saying, hey, be aware of this stuff. And then it's not just the FTC. The Better Business Bureau is also all over this. Here's another link. And they're talking about folks who are engaging in essentially tax fraud scams, where they are calling you and they're saying that they're from the IRS or they're from the Better Business Bureau or whoever they're saying they're from. And they're saying, hey, I can help you get your federal stimulus package. Or I can help you get your $1,200 or $2,400 that you're entitled under the stimulus package. And they try to get you to go to a website and put in some information, or they try to just take information over the phone and get you to give the attacker information that they can then use to engage in identity theft. Again, similar, if you go to this website, they also give you some recommendations on ways to avoid this. But this is the same exact thing that the FTC is telling you about. Stay vigilant against these types of attacks and be aware that they exist. And this, again, isn't anything new. This has been going on for a long, long time, and folks should do whatever they can that they were doing before to be aware of this and make sure they're not falling prey to these types of attacks. OCR is also standing up a portal associated with coronavirus. So there's again a link here, and I put this in because they're also highlighting a new type of scan associated with coronavirus, where scammers are offering you tests to Medicare beneficiaries in exchange for your personal details, including Medicare information. So this one is interesting because they're not asking you for your payment information. They're instead asking you for your personal details and for your Medicare information. And the reason that they're doing this is because they want your information so then they can engage in federal healthcare program identity theft. And they have the kind of on the bottom here that they will use the information that you give them to engage in insurance theft or Medicare theft or Medicaid theft or what have you. And so this is just a new type of attack. If you go to this link, HHS has a whole page devoted to coronavirus. They talk about how the HHS changes to HIPAA enforcement that I mentioned in the last one of these, where they're kind of, for telehealth at least, they're excusing some non-compliance associated with using FaceTime, Google Hangouts, and the like because of this event and the national emergency. They also talk about how anti-kickback statutes are kind of changed in the light of this. So they have some great guidance on this coronavirus portal that they just stood up. So I urge you to check that out. I also want to note, just kind of switching gears, that data breaches still happen in this time. So Marriott, I got this email this morning, and I was a valued guest, I guess, that may be impacted by this event. And essentially, what happened is some fraudsters were accessing a Marriott franchise's portal or what have you, and they were accessing information that they should not access. And from mid January of 2020, and then, as Marriott says here, they confirmed the login credentials were disabled. They began their investigation. They included additional monitoring. And then they say, hey, my information was one of the information that was accessed. You can go to mysupport.marriott.com to learn more about this event. I'm not really picking on Marriott at all here, except to say that data breaches still happen in this time, and folks are still responding to these breaches. So though you may be sitting at home or thinking about how you can do everything you can to support your business or to protect your family in this time or whatever you're doing, just know that these events still happen, and Marriott gives you some information as you would get in all breaches that, hey, here's are the things you can do to protect yourself, like a credit freeze and the like. So you may want to, if you do get one of these notices, react to it the same way you would outside of this event. I also want to note that regulatory enforcement is still happening in this time. And this is with Zoom bombing. So the New York Attorney General sent a letter to Zoom very recently, worried about the increased traffic associated with Zoom and Zoom's existing security practices. And this is from a New York Times article that I've linked here. But with everyone being at home, folks are using Zoom in brand new ways. If you remember the last one of these, I was talking about how we at our law firm were using Zoom for a happy hour. So Friday at the end of it worked great, by the way. Friday at the end of the day, we all got on via video. We played some Jackbox TV games and kind of just talked, had a drink, and just communicated as a team that way since we couldn't meet in person. And a lot of people are doing that, not only for work, but also in their personal lives. You might get your Bible study group together or your just group of friends together on Zoom and talking and what have you. That increased traffic has got the AG concerned. And the AG says, hey, we're concerned that your practices might not be sufficient to adapt to the sudden surge in volume and sensitivity of data being passed through your network. Volume, it could be just people having a happy hour, but sensitivity, there's people talking about doing depositions over Zoom, people talking about engaging in telehealth over Zoom, just using Zoom in ways that they probably didn't think that it would be used for prior to this event. And so the AG is asking Zoom for its practices. In addition to that, Zoom kind of very quickly changed its privacy statement on Sunday of this week. And you see this is from Eric Wan that, hey, Zoom, it linked to Zoom's new privacy policy. This is a tweet from yesterday. But Zoom updated its privacy policy on Sunday in reaction to some folks looking at it and being concerned about cookie practices and things of that nature. So Zoom has updated their privacy statement. It's just interesting to note that this kind of new platform, not a new platform, old platform being used in new ways and with new amount of volume because of this event. And regulators are attached to that and are sending Zoom some questions. I also want to note that privacy is not stopping in bill creation. This is an act, a bill from the Indiana legislature associated with kind of changing how insurance companies are regulated in Indiana. This passed, and it's at the governor's desk right now to for assessment. So it could be vetoed, of course, or signed. And I just had a couple snippets from this act. It was an act all about insurance regulation. There's all sorts of things in the act, but one particular section is associated with, hey, an insurance company needs to maintain a comprehensive written information security program that has a risk assessment, contains some technical safeguards, and protects against unlawful access to that information. So just wanted to highlight, if you're now outside of Indiana, you may not care about this, but I just wanted to highlight that bill activity is still happening. There's been still talks about a federal privacy bill that is kind of in the works and constantly being discussed on the Hill, and also at the state level, this stuff is still happening. I also want to focus in on regulators are not stopping just in the United States, but also in the EU. This is from March 19th, a couple weeks ago, where the EDPB is saying that, hey, we're going to still enforce the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, during this time. Although your business may have changed dramatically, we're still here and we're still going to enforce this regulation. This is interesting because where you've seen in the United States, at least with OCR and other regulators that have come out, where they're kind of excusing some activities associated with privacy during this event. Like I mentioned last time and earlier here, that HHS is excusing for telehealth purposes the use of FaceTime. And whereas the EDPB is kind of going the other way and saying, hey, we're still here and we expect you to conform to GDPR requirements in the event of this situation. And I want to focus in on one thing from this statement, and you can download the whole statement at that link in your upper left there. But one of the things to stop the spread of COVID 19 is this was done very well, I think, in South Korea and also Singapore, where what they did is they would find someone who tested positive and they would then go out and monitor their cell phone activity and figure out everywhere that they went in order to understand who they have come in contact with, who else could also be infected and needs to be quarantined. And at least the news articles coming out from there at this time are saying that that was a very effective process. Of course, if you're kind of a privacy advocate, you're sitting there thinking, well, the government is now looking at my mobile location data to understand where I went to see who I might have come into contact with. So outside of this maybe serving public health, there's some concerns with that situation. And Edward Snowden, I think, last week had some things to say about that governments are going to start implementing these types of things, and then it's not going to stop when this event ends, which was an interesting take on it, I thought. But I want to focus in on what the regulators over in the EU said on this specific matter. They said, hey, if you're going to use mobile location data to monitor, contain, or mitigate coronavirus, you really should make sure that you're doing it in a way that conforms to the GDPR. And there's some bolded language. Public authorities should first seek to process location data in an anonymous way, which is interesting because how could you possibly process location data in an anonymous way in order to track someone like Singapore and South Korea were doing? So this is a kind of a weird comment from them. I'm just not sure what the anonymous data could really be helpful for. How could aggregate data maybe to determine where people were, how many people might have been in one area at one time? But this is just kind of a weird thing that they said, hey, try to do this in an anonymous way. I'm not sure how you would do that because the whole point is identifying someone and saying you may have come in contact with Nick Merker. Nick Merker was infected. You probably should quarantine. So I thought that was interesting. And then it says if you can't process anonymous data, then you need to introduce legislative measures to safeguard public security. So they're essentially saying if you want, and this is within the GDPR Article 15 as it has here, but if you want to do this, you need to introduce some sort of legislative protection to safeguard public security. We don't want mass spying of the public in Europe, is really what this is saying to me. And so this is just a really interesting take. It's kind of different from what other states have done, and so that's why I wanted to talk about it here. And then the last, actually, two more things I want to talk about. One is the California Consumer Privacy Act, and I'm going to spend a little time on the Privacy Act in case you're not familiar with it, kind of what it is and how it applies. But this was big because in a Forbes article about a week ago, an advisor for the California Attorney General had this quote. And that person said that we're enforcing the law upon finalizing the rules or July 1st, whichever comes first. Which was really interesting for two reasons. One of which I'll get into: finalizing the rules or July 1st, whichever comes first. So let's get to that here in a minute. Let me tell you what the CCPA is if you're not familiar. So the United States historically has taken what is called kind of a sectoral or industry approach to privacy, where our laws work based on the industry you're in. So if you are a hospital, the HIPAA might apply to you because you engage in electronic medical transactions. Whereas if you're a hot dog vendor and you're just selling things for cash on Times Square, HIPAA probably doesn't apply for you. So quick example: if you're engaging with a hot dog vendor, you sell a hot dog to person A, they give you $5 back. You're on Times Square, hot dog vendor, and in that transaction, you say, "Oh, by the way, before I tell you this hot dog, what type of do you have diabetes? Please tell me if you have diabetes." If the person responds to you, the HIPAA doesn't apply. The hot dog vendor can do whatever they want with that data. Now, there may be state laws that apply, but HIPAA generally doesn't apply. Compare that to if you tell your doctor you have diabetes in a hospital, HIPAA applies. The doctor can't go tell his friend that, for example. So we've taken an industry approach. The California Consumer Privacy Act is an omnibus law that's modeled after the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation. And an omnibus law means the law applies to every business the exact same way. Whereas if you're a hot dog vendor or a hospital, this law applies to you in the same way. And there's no criteria that you have to first get into before the law applies, except some based on revenue that I'm going to talk about in a couple slides. I also should note that entities that are processing data under HIPAA or Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act or some other federal law, there's exclusions for that under the CCPA. But the idea is that this is an omnibus law. It applies to every entity in the exact same way. So two things about the CCPA that are interesting. One, it became effective January 1st. However, the Attorney General, as we saw in the quote, they're not going to enforce the CCPA until July 1st or they finish their regulations, whichever comes first. The CCPA regulations are still pending. So the CCPA text, the statute itself, has language saying that the Attorney General is going to come in with these kind of implementing regulations, and these implementing regulations are going to tell you how to interpret the CCPA. There's a four-part, really quick. I'm not going to go through this completely just for time, but I just want to note that this, although I said this is an omnibus law, it doesn't apply to everybody. It applies to for-profit entities that make over $25 million, is kind of the gist of it. If you are a nonprofit, this doesn't apply to you. I underlined for-profit there. But if you're a for-profit entity, you collect personal information, and you do business in California, and you have revenue of over 25 million, this law applies to you. So the hot dog vendor in Times Square, it probably actually doesn't apply to that person, but a hot dog conglomerate in California, it probably applies to them. So just kind of think of that on the things I'm about to discuss. So why is the CCPA important? Uh, the most important thing here is items 2 and items 4. Item 2 is that California residents now have these broad right of access, right of deletion, right to be free from discrimination, rights against your company or to your company. So let's take an example. If you're an entity that collects or sells subscription services or engages in marketing activity to folks in California, and you're constantly sending emails or communicating with folks in California, and they send a request to you that says, "Hey, I want you to give me all the information you have about me." You have to actually respond to that request, and you have to do so within 45 days, with an opportunity for one extension. So it's actually 90 days, but you have to actually give them the data that you have about them. And the definition of personal data or personal information under the CCPA is so broad, it includes things you might not think would be within what we usually culturally consider in the United States personal information. Real quick example is if you run a call center and people call into your call center and you take notes during the calls. That's probably personal information if it's associated with an individual on the other end. So if you know that Nick Merker called into your call center and Nick Merker was a huge jerk, just yelling at you over the phone, just being outright rude at your company, and you take notes on that call saying, hey, Nick Merker was a big jerk. I wish he didn't have service with us. I wish he would go away. This person's terrible. And that's all within your call center tracking software. If then Nick Merker makes a request of your company for all the information you have about Nick Merker, you have to give me those notes. And that historically, I mean, culturally in the United States, we wouldn't consider that personal information. But the definition under the CCPA is that it's any information relating to an identified or identifiable individual. So it's not only the things we would think about: social security number, name, address, phone number, all the stuff you would just commonly think is personal information, but it's all the stuff associated with that individual. So, for example, your things you've purchased on Amazon, that's your personal information. What things you've watched on Netflix in the last 5 days, that's your personal information under this law. We really haven't considered it in that way before. And this is modeled off the Europeans' General Data Protection Regulation as well. The fourth bullet, another big thing about the CCPA is that it grants a private right of action in data breach situations. So, although the Attorney General is not enforcing this law right now, there is still an opportunity for a private right of action, and it's not really happened yet. There's been one case I think that was filed about a month ago that referenced the CCPA, but there is a private right of action available. And the private right of action exists in the event that your company loses personal information of individuals, and it's done so because your company did not have reasonable security practices. So having reasonable security practices is a safeguard, affirmative defense to this private right of action. So if you have a data breach and you don't have reasonable security, someone can file a private right of action, likely a class action lawsuit against your company. Now, there's a process they have to go through under the CCPA. They have to notify the Attorney General, and there's things they have to do. But the gist of it is they can file a class action lawsuit and seek statutory damages of some dollar amount per individual impacted. And it's a very low dollar amount. I think it's $250 or something around that area. It's just a small number. However, if you start stacking things up, it can be a high amount of theoretical statutory damages very quick. So if you have a million people whose information is lost, take a million times that statutory number, that starts to be a big number. So that's why the CCPA is important, and its individuals or businesses should be concerned about it. So I just want to touch on two more things with the CCPA. Is that one, those implementing regulations are currently in draft, and they were amended in February to include things about notice, business practices for handling consumer requests, how you verify one of these requests coming in, and then they were amended again in March, where they removed a sample opt-out button. I didn't really talk about this, but you have to give consumers the ability to opt out of your sale of their data, and they showed you how you could do that in the February regulations with an example opt out button. They've now removed that. They removed guidance on IP addresses, those in the February or the first set of regulations, and then they added just-in-time notice information. So these things are in flight. They initially released these regulations last year. They were then changed in February based on community feedback. Now they're changed again in March based on community feedback. So these things are not done, and if it's kind of like a moving target. If you just go this first bullet, they remove the sample opt-out button. So if you follow what their sample opt-out button is in the last set of regulations, well, now that's no longer the guidance. Now it's probably that sample opt-out button was okay, but they removed it because people didn't want to do that specific one. But they're changing, they're moving the target for you here. And whenever these regulations are done, as I said in the quote 4 slides ago, they're going to start enforcing the CCPA. Just the last thing I'll touch on is it's not really been talked about in the last month because of the situation, other privacy items, but there's a new law coming into Brazil that takes effect August 14th of 2020. So if you are doing business in Brazil, it's a law that almost completely copies the GDPR. If you're familiar with that. But this law takes effect August 14th of 2020. So if things go back to kind of how they were in terms of business productivity, not until June or not until July or what have you, you're 1 month away from this law coming into force. So it might be something to think about now if you're doing business in Brazil. How are you going to prepare for that law when it comes down the pike to August 14th? And similar to GDPR, it has high fines associated with it. 2% of sales revenue in Brazil, up to 50 million. And so these laws are coming down the pike. Although this event is going on, there's a lot of regulatory activity still. There's new laws. There's new scams out there that regulators are helping you try to protect yourself from. It's just that privacy doesn't stop because folks might be sitting at home. And so, with that, thank you for tuning into Privacy Chat, and I'll be back tomorrow at 1 p.m. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that folks have in the chat. And just as a final note, again, you can find me at nmerker at any of these channels on the right here, or you can email me at nick@icemiller.com.